Welcome viewers to the series Exploring Careers in the Green Economy. This episode is entitled The Role of Advocacy, People Power, and Social Movements in Accelerating the Green Economy. My name is Ava Morgan, and I'm class of 2022 at Middlebury College, and I'd like to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by Michael Silberman, class of 2002, and founder and former executive director of Mobilization Lab. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Thanks, Ava. Good to be here back at Middlebury virtually.
So this series explores a number of different professional areas involved in the green economy. Can you tell us first a little bit about your organization, Mobilization Lab, how it got started, and how it fits into the green economy?
Sure. Yeah, we started the Mobilization Lab back in 2011 at a pretty interesting moment. It started at Greenpeace, and it was right as the Copenhagen climate talks were ending. Greenpeace realized that after the talks collapsed and we didn't get the fair and binding global deal that everyone had hoped for, and Greenpeace, like many other big international campaigning groups, environmental groups, looked back and said, well, what happened? How did this become such a disappointment? And Greenpeace noticed two things. One, that we weren't leveraging the potential of what people, activists everywhere could do in its own campaigning. It was starting to see more people rising up, more people being mobilized and activated around climate change, but Greenpeace realizing, well, it could do more. And then second, the rise of digital tools and digital activism. And so, Greenpeace was part of one of the largest petitions in history with Avaz and 350 and others for the climate talks, but it wasn't sufficient. And so it said, how can we think differently as an organization, as a global organization, about how we're leveraging all these new tools and how we're putting people at the center of our campaigns instead of working in this kind of more traditional way where Greenpeace grew up in the 70s, working with only a certain set of tools and tactics, nonviolent direct action, and certain kinds of communication strategies and mind bombs that remained very popular and were very effective for many years and are still part of the Greenpeace strategy, but realizing it's time for an update. So Greenpeace said, we're going to find some people who, or in my case, recruited me to start what became the Digital Mobilization Lab so that we could retool and rewire how this global campaigning organization was thinking about its campaigns so it could be effective more effective in the coming decades.
So what sorts of organizations use your resources and the trainings that Mobilization Lab provides? And if any, do you work with any collaborators in the same space?
Yeah, so we worked exclusively with Greenpeace for about 5 years, and Greenpeace and it's across 50 different countries and its supporters and activists and allies. And then after having a big impact there, we spun out and since 2017 have been working with other campaigning groups, large and small, and not just in climate. So we do work with, groups like 350 and other climate efforts, but also people working on inequality like Oxfam, human rights like Amnesty International, child rights like UNICEF. And so those are the larger groups who have more to do in terms of retooling and rethinking how to modernize and how to be more participatory and people-centered in the work, but also networks of grassroots groups or individual or smaller or grassroots campaigners who are trying to figure out how to integrate best available strategy, tactics, and tools into their advocacy campaigns.
And so you mentioned earlier this rise of digital presence, and I was wondering, in your opinion, how has this rapid increase in all of our digital presences affected the advocacy space? And then also, what do you think this space is going to look like in the future, given that rise?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. Since graduating Middlebury in 2003 and in February 2003, my first job was on this presidential campaign based out of Vermont. Ever since then, that campaign at that time was known for this pioneering use of the internet to mobilize an unprecedented number of people to make former Governor of Vermont Howard Dean, the presumed nominee for the Democratic Party. And since even that date now, nearly 20 years ago, the trend has continued. It's just different tools where we're just seeing each year there's more ways that more people can take control over, well, maybe not control, but can use new tools, new communication tools, new organizing tools to mobilize other people, to inspire other people, to raise money, to do it, with, again, what's increasingly more power in their pockets as well, with mobile phones, to campaign. And so that trend seems to continue. It's just it's morphing in new ways. Right now we're talking about audio only platforms that didn't exist before, where people are listening, whether Clubhouse and things like, it's constantly evolving what that looks like. And and I think what has changed is the number of people that we are now able to reach. And of course there's many other impacts where we have governments trying to get in the game and silence different voices, and because everyone is online or close to everyone, increasing majority, and so it's now becoming a new town square that before digital was an additional place to go, and now it is, especially has happened even more during COVID when people have been locked to their screens even further. The data is showing it has become even more of the town square and the gathering places, and the primary way in which the primary place where culture is being shaped and where ideas are being shared, and of course where now people are able to find each other to collaborate and take action or plan actions, like we saw, unfortunately quite recently, even with the Capitol here where I am in DC.
That segues pretty well into my next question, which is, what do you think that the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic has had on climate action, climate advocacy, and do you think that will have a lasting effect in the future?
At two levels. It's helped us see through, for example, these mutual aid groups popping up and people in communities able to work together to come up with new solutions quickly to make sure vulnerable people are supported, get fed, or get taken to get vaccines now, things like that. And so I think I hope there's a correlation between the forms of civic action that we're seeing and climate action or climate advocacy, as people see a positive feedback loop and their actions making a difference in the world. But I also hope that and I think it's too soon to know, but on a larger scale, we've had to retool entire systems and supply chains and make quick political decisions. Systems have been stressed. Political systems, social systems, economic systems have been stressed to the brink by COVID. And I think it is the closest lived experience that anyone has to what we've been hearing for decades about the impacts that climate disruption will have on our lives. And so my hope is that some of that sense of anything is possible, we can change historical patterns, we can transform systems quickly if needed, if there's a will carry forward and benefit us as we shift gears or re-elevate as soon as we're able here the climate questions. And I think thirdly is we're starting to see, fortunately, it's been a lot of good work to think about how does a COVID recovery also become a green recovery. Lots of different language around this, but if we're going to be redesigning sectors of our society, how can we continue to do so in a way that is also going to save us not just from the immediate pandemic, but also from the larger climate pandemic, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And so going back a little bit to your role in Mobilization Lab as the founder and former director, sort of on a daily basis? What are your main responsibilities? What does that look like?
Mm. It falls into, I mean, I think the exciting part about a leadership role is that it can touch on multiple areas. So, and I think different people enjoy them at different levels, but I often think about it as like the internal and the external, and larger organizations sometimes have different people doing that, where you have the external work for me involved fundraising, figuring out, that's always probably number one on people's list. How do we make sure we are generating the revenue, whether that's through fundraising or work, talking to potential training partners, organizations that wanted us to coach them or train them or take them through campaign design workshops, and other external facing responsibilities involve looking at what's happening in the landscape and what's changing, and figuring out what is working with our team to figure out what does that mean for us. And so we would often write, at the beginning of COVID, we work together to figure out, okay, what does this mean for the organizations we serve and support? And so scanning that landscape to see, okay, and being in touch with the people we aim to serve and listening, and then figuring out how we adapt what we're doing to make sure it's most relevant. And so during early in COVID, it was about listening to organizations to see what was stressing them out the most, and bringing them together on virtual calls for people in the advocacy sector to talk to each other and start sharing strategies and tips on how we organize remotely, or if we can't go to people's doors, if we can't be out on the street, how can we mobilize and communicate in new ways. So, and then of course, internally, we want to, you're always, I was always thinking about, what does it mean to have a healthy team, healthy culture? Are our systems and processes working? Again, partnering with the right people on the team who also have those responsibilities to manage all those different parts. And so, but yeah, and then often, when possible, getting involved in actually delivering the work, or being part of a training or coaching an organization. And I think for me, that is actually one of the biggest challenges of a executive director role, is I think you increasingly get farther and farther away as you build a team that hopefully is functioning really well and ultimately doesn't even need you there, right, at some point. Then it means you might be less and less involved in the mission itself. And so that's my reflection of the last, when you're running a startup or a nonprofit, your main focus, I think, is on trying to make sure that organization is able to keep going and can achieve its mission. And then if you're lucky, you can also spend time, I think, on the mission more directly.
Right. And so you mentioned the most challenging part for you in your role. But what do you find most rewarding about that leadership position?
To me, the most rewarding part is building something that has that's bigger than you and your team. And so I really saw that with Mob Lab. I think we were able to respond to some needs in our community and add a valuable service, knowledge sharing and publishing regular newsletters about what we're seeing out there, what our people in our network we're seeing around the world about what works in modern campaigning and advocacy, and or helping. I think most rewarding is, I guess, the moments when you see or you hear the feedback from a training or or work with an organization where they're saying, this completely transformed how I think about my job, how I think about how I will do my job, how I'm going to work with my colleagues, and so that sense of having made an impact on one person's life or a team or an organization is somewhat immeasurable. And I think, and then likewise the feeling being able to have building, I think the pride that you can take, or that I and the team have been able to take in building something that is larger than just the number of staff on team, something that many people have beyond networks of people contribute to building and supporting and finding ways to make it work, and are continuing to find new ways to make Mob Lab achieve its mission is a very satisfying or rewarding outcome.
Mhm. And so looking a little broader in the green economy, what areas in this space do you think will see the most job growth in the coming years? And then also, what fields do you think have the greatest importance in addressing the climate crisis?
It feels like every company and organization is partaking in a green economy, or is increasingly compelled to, even if they don't currently identify, right? You have, you know, automakers scrambling to think about electric vehicles, right? I mean, that never would have previously identified as part of a green economy, right? Or not long ago. You have, I think, social enterprises and businesses. You have leaders like Patagonia, who are seeing it as their mission to not just make a buck or prevent harm, but also to do good and to make a positive influence. And so I think it's hard to answer the question, because I think we're going to start to see, like, as we reach more of a tipping point, we're seeing more and more parts of society, from the private sector, like I mentioned, to even parts of government. In the new Biden administration, we have all kinds of new configurations of, it's not just the EPA or Department of Energy thinking about climate. We have these cross-departmental, cross-agency task forces, or every agency needs to have a climate person or a client. And so I think that, or more than a person, right? So I think it's probably more the narrow set of what parts of the economy are going to not have growth, because it feels like the majority. There are obviously some dirty energy industries that are suffering, but I think it's more like how is the growth and the renewed focus across the economy and across politics and across everything in the environment and in climate and becoming sustainable or having a positive impact. How is that now changing? And I think that's the trend line, and it's getting very serious, right? Where you have, so for example, job growth, there's new roles. Increasingly companies are in many countries being required now to, or at least in European countries, report on their supply chain and the sustainability of their manufacturing processes, right? Human rights and elements of the supply chain, but obviously like environmental, energy. And so there's all kinds of roles now for how do you measure that? How do you track that? How do you report against that? How do you make that part of how does that sit alongside the very detailed financial accounting and reporting that companies are compelled to do? And so I think, those are the kinds of curious new roles, or not curious, but things that are just going to start, we're going to see more and more of as being standard.
Mm-hmm. And looking a little bit into the future, is there a space that you want to explore that you haven't previously in this sort of advocacy space?
Yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly interested in how the advocacy strategies, tools, and tactics that we've helped many of these nonprofit groups integrate and adapt and evolve, how those will be used by the for-profit sector or the private sector as they start to, again, realize their role. We're seeing evidence of groups like companies like Uber suddenly activating their customers with they put a little new button on their app because they don't like a certain policy that might threaten their company. They might not be mobilizing and activating their customers for a common good. In that case, it's their own self-interest. But what happens when companies with many more fans or customers than, tens of millions of people compared to the size of a nonprofit organization, even the largest ones. What happens when they start adopting and using those tools? And so, yeah, I'm interested in the corporate what corporate campaigning is going to look like as companies start to get more involved in doing social good, or activating their customers to also once companies minimize their own carbon footprints and then start thinking about, great, now how do we, Coca-Cola is launching a bottle recycling program. Probably lots to be looked at there about the effect or how useful and all that, but they are likely to start mobilizing how many millions of customers and to participate in bringing bottles back. And so what does that look like? What tools that we traditionally and strategies that we traditionally would see in the nonprofit sector and that advocacy groups have been the primary users of or drivers of for so long? What does that look like when the private sector gets in the game of advocacy?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that all with us. I'm a little curious about your path from Middlebury to your current job.
Sure.
So at Mid, you majored in political science and environmental studies.
Yeah.
And I would love to know a little bit about how you got from there to founding and directing these organizations.
It's not linear. There's not a clear path that I can point to. I think having a liberal arts background was more important probably than having any specific courses or classes under my belt. I think the ability to be open, be able to the focus on communicating and writing and reading, and and even the space at Middlebury I was involved in, helping Middlebury become one of the first carbon neutral campuses, and working with different parts of between student government and the administration and facilities, and everyone as a whole community worked together to figure out how can we do this ambitious thing. And it didn't happen until several years after I was gone. But those kinds of learning, experiential learning, practical learning, I think made me curious and open, and but also gave me the skills to then feel somewhat confident going into new environments. And so my first job, like I mentioned, was just up the road in Burlington on this presidential campaign, and that was very much a startup environment. And that I was always I was interested in politics, but like environment and all kinds of, but didn't know what I wanted to do. And so that gave me a great place to demonstrate that I was able to be a good listener and a good worker, and contribute. And I think and then one thing led to another. So that campaign ended, and then a bunch of us who were for a year working together on issues we cared about for this campaign, and who learned a lot about how to mobilize millions of people through the internet, decided to see if we could start a consultancy. And we started and moved to DC, and there's more to that story, but that organization's still going. And I think for me, I guess when I look back, there wasn't a prescribed path, and I was, I knew what I was some of the things I was interested in, but I didn't focus too much on trying to design a path for how to get from A to B. I was more focused on what are the things that are important to me and interesting to me, and can I be open to, and then along the path you learn about, you meet people, you learn things, and opportunities, I think, can emerge that way. So
you now sort of work at this intersection of people and technology and strategy and equity, and like, how did you synthesize all of those things?
Yeah, well, I think that the people part, so the technology and the environment kind of part came naturally. I think the moment for me early on this Dean campaign, the people part came in on the Dean campaign. And that's where I got to see and experience something that I'd never previously experienced. I was working on a much smaller scale when we were making change on campus at Middlebury. It was, all with, X number of people, it was this person and that person, and great, we'll have a meeting. But on the Dean campaign, the program I was leading was this meetup program where through the internet, we were supporting 200,000 people who were getting together in their communities, and 1,300 leaders who were organizing their own communities and having these meetups where they would bring new people into the campaign, and they would take on these actions like writing letters and making phone calls and doing this really critical work for the campaign. And that is where I saw the potential of what people who, how committed people can make a real difference. And the technology part lit up for me because that enabled us to scale some things that previously would have taken many more phone calls or many more door knocks or many more human interactions. And we still need all those human interactions too, but I just saw I realized how in that experience that ordinary, how powerful people are. And I think, unfortunately, many organizations or campaigns don't, I've seen this since, don't believe as deep, often undersell or, are worried about trusting people with the mission or with the work or with the campaign. And that's why, unlike movements that depend upon the full participation of people everywhere. And so it can often become very not equitable and not inclusive when when organizations assume that they're the only people, or they're the only ones who have the answers, or they're the only ones who could take a project or campaign forward and fail to think about what would happen if we open this up more, or took a back seat and let the most impacted people lead because they're have more powerful voices and have more to say and more to lose. And so for me, that's where a lot of this all came together. It was actually just in that first job I was lucky to stumble into right after graduating.
And also in 2020, a lot of those conversations about equity and justice have really been brought to the forefront. Has that changed anything that you guys have been doing at Mobilization Lab?
It's forced the conversations about equity and justice that have always been important as a social justice organization to us, and always been relevant. And I think, and they're part of what Mob Lab has for many years been helping organizations in some ways address, because the Mob Lab's purpose is to help organizations adapt and be more open, be more inclusive, be more participatory in terms of how it's planning and how it's inviting people in. And so it's always been, to some extent, part of the work, but for us as well, it forced a new conversation. And and I think, and not something that is like ever a quick answer when you're starting to do that kind of reflection work. There's no, we need to, just do this one thing, but starting to think more about our curriculum, for example. And this is, maybe I'll just give you this one example because it's probably the most concrete among several things we were talking about, but looking at where do some of the tools that we are using come from. And so there's a great deal of work that our facilitators and trainers undertook as a group to look at, hey, what kind of messages are perhaps unintentionally coming through when we use this module or this tool or this example, right? And let's look at everything we're doing through let's look at our own curriculum through an equity and justice lens, not just helping other organizations look at their own work, but instead look at, what are other ways we can open up a space when we're facilitating to make sure everyone is welcome, or everyone is able to show up in ways that are relevant for that. Anyway, we did a very thorough examination, then changed a whole bunch of things and coinciding with doing that, the virtual transition as well.
Right. And so thank you for sharing all of that about your path to your career. And so knowing what you know now and looking back at your past experiences, is there any advice that comes to mind that you would give students who currently want to work in the field of climate advocacy or digital advocacy?
For me, I was able to learn and grow very quickly in this campaign environment, and I've seen the same when in the startup environments that I've led. We've always been able. You always want to give. There's always more work than there are people in those kind of resource constrained environments, and that means if someone is, and like anyone hopefully coming out of Middlebury, is demonstrating willingness and competence and curiosity and is easy to get along with and work with, then you want to give them more stuff to do, right? And you want them to be more involved. And that's just like a natural, it's like any relationship, it's things are start to go well, you want to spend more time with that person. And so it's the same in the work environment. And I think often those, what might on the face of it look like a more chaotic or startup, you may not get that, who knows, maybe you also get the great manager who's able to coach you, but I think there's something about that more, I'll say it again, the more that startup kind of a place. So yeah, that's my main advice. And I think that's true for whether it's the green economy or for digital work.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great advice. Yeah. In thinking about your best case scenario for where we'll be in 20 or 30 or even 50 years, in one word, what do you think will have gotten us there?
Yeah, people power.
And in one word, why do you do this work?
So I guess the one word would be tikkun olam, which is this, I guess, Hebrew word that essentially says like the world comes in broken pieces. The world is essentially comes in broken pieces, and it's our opportunity. It's our mission to repair it. And so,
what a great phrase. Well, Michael, thank you once again for your engagement with us and helping students prepare for their first career destinations. This concludes this episode within the series, Exploring Careers in the Green Economy. In closing, I want to encourage viewers to tune in to career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in the series. I also want to encourage you to tune in to other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.